Hey everybody, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Bobby, and we have a special edition today because we are live at the very end of our Breaking Barriers conference. I have Pastor Andrew with us, Pastor Jonathan, and Pastor Brian. And what we're going to be doing today at the podcast, we've had a number of talks around growth and sending and multiplication and all that stuff. And so we've had a ton of good feedback and questions. And so the podcast today is really going to be jumping into those, some of the most pressing questions, stuff to sort of engage with. So I'll turn it over to you, Pastor Brian.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
So a lot of the questions that came in from our attendees revolved around the idea that, like, hey, they're here, they're hearing this stuff, they're saying yes and amen to a growth mindset. But they know when they go back home, there are other people in their church, maybe it's other staff members, maybe it's lay leaders, who just aren't quite there. They kind of feel icky about this growth. So what are some practical ways that they can lead others to believe and act on growth being a good thing?
I think that the number one thing that we can do in that way is just begin to fearlessly talk about it. And if God has wired you up and you're one of the leaders, one of the higher capacity leaders on your staff, or maybe you're the lead pastor, the vision's coming out of your guts, and we've got to be able to not hide what is in our heart. And what that's going to do is going to do two things. Number one, it's going to win some people over. They want to follow you. Maybe they've not engaged with these things. It's a little bit like that alligator story I told yesterday. There's a lot of stuff in the anti-church growth movement that sounds really good when you first hear it, and then when you actually investigate it just a little bit further, you're like, yeah, I don't know if that really squares. So you might be able to win some people over as you begin to talk positively about church growth and growth in any area, all these areas of our life. But the second thing that it's going to do, this is hard, okay? But the second thing that it's going to do is it's going to show us pretty fast who is culturally unaligned with where you're trying to go, and it's going to help them, help you see that they probably need to be in a different culture. They need to make an exit. This is not going to work for them. When you begin to narrow in on vision, you attract people to your vision, but people that are not attracted to that, they sort of no longer have a place to hide. When you're narrowing that tent, it's just like, man, this is where we're going. This is what we're doing. I'm telling you, if you do something radical next year, like say, one of the church planners here, he told me that his vision that God's birthing in him is to see 25 baptisms in 2025, which is awesome. All right, they're a smaller church, man, getting off the ground. The second you say that out loud and say, man, we are putting a goal of 25 baptisms next year, you are going to have some people that say yes and amen, and I have been dying for vision like that. Like I've been waiting for somebody with the boldness to say out loud, this is what we're trying to do. And you're going to have others that say, how dare you try to do something like that and make some kind of goal and all, and all that kind of stuff. And it's going to be all this anti-church growth stuff and all this kind of cloaked in piety and all that. Maybe you can win some of them over, but if you can't, at least you're going to be able to see who they are and help them get into a culture that maybe fits the way they're wired a little better.
That's awesome. I would just add kind of what you're saying, Andrew, is like, just don't pit numerical growth against something else. Like, if you're big on, community or discipleship or whatever, that's great. Like, just talk about that. Don't feel compelled that you have to say, hey, growth, and then immediately pit it against, well, we're not just about growth, and that's kind of just the conference speak that I think ends up kind of creating this culture where people kind of feel ashamed to talk about wanting their churches to grow. I also would say, I think the average people in our churches, they love seeing the church grow. I mean, it's awesome to them. They love seeing people come to Christ, new people they work with. I mean, there's very kind of churchy people that are going to be like, well, is it just about numbers, whatever? But I do think the average person just in your church is going to just love, when more people are coming and getting baptized and the mission's happening.
Yeah, one of our churches that are here at this conference from Georgia, he kind of mentioned to me like the exhaustion that he feels by having to qualify everything when it comes to growth. So like you can't just unapologetically say like, hey man, we're really excited that Christmas this year we're going to try to see 100 first-time guests. Then he had to do a whole 2 pages of more, but it's not just about the numbers, and it's not just about this, and he felt like it was exhausting to him. And I think what it showed is you got probably some misalignment on staff, and you either got to win those people over, and your volunteer teams win those people over, or if they're just not on board with where you're going, they're going to need to figure that out. Maybe God can they can go somewhere where they're going to be more aligned.
Hey, I would say last night up at Natty Green's, great time. We're sitting up there, and some of the guys from Houston, we're talking about some of these things, and they're talking about how a lot of the churches that they're kind of interacting with in their area, they're super into sending, multiplication, and all of that, and because of that, they're sort of anti the growth stuff. And so it's like, how do we make sure that we talk about both of these things? And I think that's a key to it. It's when you have churches that are really into multiplication, helping them understand that to continually be able to multiply and to continually be able to send, you have to keep growing. Because if you send all your people and you're not growing, you ain't got nobody left to send. And so you've got to grow to be able to send. And so those two things have to stay married.
All right, so a lot of questions came in also related to this idea of embracing pragmatism. Okay, and so this sparked some questions related to, hey, what's the wisdom in when do you lean into pragmatism? Is there any time that you should not be pragmatic as a church? Andrew, you specifically used the phrase consecrated pragmatism. I love that. So how do we consecrate our pragmatism?
Well, we got that phrase from Chuck Lawless, who heard it from Peter Wagner back in the day. He was telling us about that. But I think that the consecrated pragmatism to me is the heart behind the intentions of it. I think something can be wise or unwise, but that is inherently unclear. Like you can read the book of Proverbs and try to figure out what is wisdom, what is not. But for me, I think that I don't think you could put it in a right or wrong category. Our church has never done a big, if you come to church, you get a raffle ticket to give away a car. We would never do that. Okay. There are churches that have done that. I've seen that done. In my opinion, I would just look in at that, and I would not say, I would say we wouldn't do it, even though it's pragmatic. I would not, though, say inherently wrong or right. And that's where these conversations, I think, always want to go. I think it's even a little bit of the spirit of that question. Like, how do you get towards, can you call something black or white, wrong or right, when you come to these pragmatic things? I would say if you press it all the way to that extent, the only way you can do that is figure out if it's sinful or not. Is it sin or not? No. Well, then is it wise or not? Well, that's kind of a little bit in the eye of the beholder. We wouldn't do the giveaway raffle ticket car thing because I think it probably takes you so far away from what the mission actually is. But if somebody wanted to do that and it was working, I wouldn't tell them it was wrong. I would just tell them we're not going to do that.
Yeah, let me try to maybe add to the way that you defined it yesterday, because you only talked about it very briefly. And I think we can miss this because there is such an inherent pragmatism sounds like something maybe we shouldn't do, Where the Bible speaks clearly, we need to be all about the Bible. And, believe every single word and intention of the Bible. It's the Word of God. That's super important. Where the Bible does not speak to, which are just so many different issues, that's where we get into the area of pragmatism. And the problem is, a lot of times people say, we don't want to be pragmatists, but they certainly are already. And that's the point you were trying to make. If you have air conditioning at your church, you're a pragmatist. Seriously. No, seriously. Because air conditioning is not a biblical thing. If you are choosing to use a microphone at your church, you're a pragmatist. These are very practical things. How about this? If you have a midweek service at your church, you are a pragmatist. There's no midweek services in the New Testament, okay? These are just practical things that the Bible doesn't speak clearly to. So the point you were making was, if you're already going to do practical things, at least do them well. Like, give it your best shot to do the stuff in the Bible that's not clear. Taking in money out of church is a very good example, right? There's some very clear biblical principles about money, but it says nothing about bookkeeping, accounting, whether you're going to do an audit, how to have controls around finances. You could do that stuff bad, or you could choose to do that stuff good in a way that people are going to look in and say, that's a good way to do that. That's the point you're making. Like, hey, man, let's do the stuff that's not in the Bible as well as we can do it. Because a lot of times people that say we're not pragmatists, basically what they do is they're just on technology and everything else from about 40 years ago. Website's bad. The technology's not very good. They have a microphone, but it don't work half the time. Projectors don't work half the time. We're just saying, man, do the stuff as well as you can, resources allowed and all of that stuff.
Yeah, so it's pursuing excellence in alignment with that theological vision that you're going after.
I think that people view pragmatism as like in competition to faith. And I think, it's almost like, man, if you're using these tools of marketing, of websites, best practices around groups. I mean, think about churches now. A lot of churches now have moved away from Sunday school and into groups, and what are they doing? They're making a pragmatic choice. We don't want to spend the money on the real estate when our people already have houses. It's a pragmatic thing. It's not and so I think that what we're saying, I think a consecrated pragmatist maybe looks at all of those tools extremely positively. Like, we don't look at them as, man, well, if we're doing that, it means we're not trusting in what the Lord has given us. We look at it and go like, man, God has given us all these tools. If we keep going and we get sharper and God keeps giving us more wisdom, we're going to have even better tools and we're going to do more things. And we just view it that way. We have a spirit of like, this stuff's awesome. We can use it. Man, we want to try to use it to the glory of God.
Awesome. All right. So next question revolves around preaching. We believe that preaching has a primary role in disciple making, but not everyone is gifted or called to preach. So how can we avoid the mindset where a church member feels like their only role in disciple making is to invite people to hear the, quote, anointed preacher?
Man, I want to hear what you guys have to say about this, but this is near to me because I think that what we have kind of been steeped in. Okay, so the question is, everybody doesn't have the gift to preach, so how do they engage? Well, what did we do in the church over the last 20 years? We took that pendulum, we swung it all the way the other way. And what we said is, well, everybody must have the gift of evangelism. And so everybody should be, we're all involved in disciple making, but what that looks like for every single person, whether they are a leader, a pastor, a stay-at-home mom, a business person, is, that they are individually soul winning, individually raising people up that can then individually go soul win. I mean, how many times have we heard this stuff? You haven't made a disciple until your disciples made a disciple who made a disciple who made a disciple, right? And it's this individual lineage kind of thing. And I think what we're saying is, no, it's really not that. Everybody's not gifted to preach. Everybody is not gifted in evangelism. In the same way everybody's not gifted in generosity. It doesn't mean everybody shouldn't be attempting and to be equipped to give, even though they're not maybe given the gift of generosity. I think the same thing is true of evangelism. We want to equip our people to be able to share. But there are going to be people in our church that individually win souls like crazy over the course of their life because God has supernaturally wired them to do that. All right? Then there's all these people in between that he has still supernaturally gifted in other areas to do things in the church, and to make hospitable environments and to create, wealth to be able to give so that the movement can go forward. To be people who care and shepherd and are there when people are hurting. I mean, I just think it's a little bit of a myopic view to kind of say, everybody is going to be gifted in the same way to do X. I would say, no, it's not. We're all gifted to build the kingdom and build the church, but that's going to look different for every single person. The preaching ministry is going to be where the bulk of the evangelism and discipleship is happening. But there's many other things that the church is doing, So that's how I would approach it, right off the bat.
Yeah, I would say that, when you think about what is the primary way that we're supposed to reach the world, that's through planting churches. You plant churches around the world, and it's the churches that are reaching people. And so preaching is an aspect of what the church does. So people are going to come to the church, they're going to hear the gospel proclaimed, but there are so many other people that may not be the preacher that's there, but that doesn't mean that they are not sharing in the load of participating in the preaching of the gospel and using their other gifts, by creating those environments that you're talking about, by being the friendly face welcoming someone in, by being the person in your neighborhood that's inviting people to come. So it's like all the gifts of the church come together. And I think a lot of times we tend to think, because our culture is so individualistic, we think that it's the preacher that's the one that's sharing the gospel, when what it really is, it's the church coming together using all of the gifts combined to create that experience where the gospel is proclaimed.
Yeah, I would say one of the ways that we try to create this at Mercy Hill, our connections process, the very first thing that we tell people is, hey, Ephesians 2:10, there are works that God has outlined specifically for you. God has gifted you. If you are here, there is a place to serve in Mercy Hill. And our role as a church is to build you up and to help you to walk in those gifts. Sometimes as a church, we can make it seem like the people exist for the church. And, hey, we got to use you. We got to have, serving this and that. We're very clear, hey, the church exists to build you up. This is why we're here. This is what the church is. And not to make one spiritual gift feel more important than another one, because, that's the body of Christ. We're all playing our part. Just one quick example, something I've been encouraged at here at Mercy Hill. One of our campuses that were sort of started out of necessity over the last year, our North Regional campus, that campus is almost totally run by volunteers, and it's amazing. People getting there early, just totally owning not even our staff, like just people using their gifts and just owning it, and it's one of our largest campuses, and there's so much energy and momentum, and it's like, man, how awesome is this? These people are here just owning the mission, and that's what it's all about, like there's not one gift that's more important than another, and that's the body of Christ.
Man, we just find ourselves in this weird age in the church where someone who faithfully serves in kids ministry with 7 and 8-year-olds and teaches them the Bible every single week, you have church consultant guru people that would divorce that from disciple making. That's crazy. But that's where we live. It's like, well, no, you just like serving kids, but we're talking about like making disciples that make disciples that make disciples. We're talking about like, and all they mean is one-on-one mentoring. Well, that's what they mean. But, to me, that's crazy. Like what we need to do is say every single person that's out there in our churches, they're not a cog in the wheel. They're uniquely spiritually gifted. We're trying to help them figure out, man, where does that plug in so that you can play your part? We're not all an eye. We're not all a hand. We're not all an ear. It all goes together, and we come together as the body, and, man, we need to celebrate that. I didn't say this yesterday in my talk, but like, right now we live in an age where I think when people say like who discipled you, they're looking for you to tell them one name. And it's like, man, in my life, over the course of my life, when you start adding up the people who have discipled me, it would be hundreds of people. And I think that's true of any believer. If they ever taught you a Sunday school lesson, man, if they ever were there early to set up things so that you could be at an event for a camp, if they were ever there, if they preached, if they led worship, they are in that discipleship tree in your life. And it's not just this one person who happened to, read The Way of the Master with you one time or whatever over 6 weeks. Like that's my discipler, So I think that's what we're trying to get away from and say, man, everybody has a role to play. Whether you've invited someone in, you're helping with kids, you're on the work production team, you're preaching the sermon, God's gifted you to be part of the thing that's helping it go.
Yeah. Thank God for Daniel and Brandon in your life, right?
Yeah. They are my disciplers, though, actually. Daniel and Brandon are my mentors, one-on-one mentors, yes.
Yeah, it reminds me, sometimes we even say this, the sermon starts in the parking lot, right? To kind of heighten the value that everyone plays in the church body. All right, so one attendee is leading a church and looking to start a second service. And so they'd like to hear your thoughts on going to either a second Sunday morning service versus a weeknight service, similar to like what we do here at Mercy Hill on Thursday nights.
Yeah, I would say the way that we view that, a lot of times when you have one service, you're asking the question, when do we have enough people to go to 2 services, and do we have enough momentum for that? And that's a reasonable question to ask. But the way that we view it is you're going to be able to grow a lot easier by having two services anyways. And so if we can help it, we always try to attend one, serve one. It gives people an opportunity to be able to serve at church and to also attend and to not disconnect those. And so I would just encourage people as early as you can. We would encourage our church planners, like as early as you can, go to two services if you can make it happen, with the amount of people and volunteers and all of that, because it's going to just give you a much better shot to grow. We have just found, honestly, the more services you have, the more opportunity to grow because of people's schedules. When people can come, I mean, it just provides more opportunities. So I would definitely do the two services on Sunday before probably doing an additional service.
I would say too, one of the things that we've learned, this is very practical, but it comes out to be true. One of those rule of thumb things is when we started our Thursday night service, we went to some other churches that are doing Thursday night services, and they told us, hey, you're never going to get more than about half of what you get on a normal Sunday morning service to come on a Thursday night. And it was like, man, how could that be true? It's totally true. All right, so I think a lot of people have this vision of Thursday night, like, oh man, this thing could blow up and be bigger than our Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, and that's just not what happens. So that's a good rule of thumb. On the best day, about half of what happens on a Sunday morning service is going to be what you're able to get on a Thursday night service. And I'm going to tell you why. Man, you go to a Thursday night service, it's a major shift in your schedule because with families and all that kind of stuff, man, it's just hard to give another night away. And it's hard for people to volunteer. It's awesome. It's a great service. I would say it's one of our best services here. People are super bought into it. But it'll be half of what you find on a Sunday morning.
I think there's a couple of churches in the room that are like walking through this kind of issue right now. And so like one of those, I think what you said, absolutely. If you currently have one service and you're looking, where am I going to add the second? It's definitely Sunday that you need to add the second. Once you get past that second and you start looking at a third, that's when people start wondering, should it be 3 services on a Sunday or should we add a midweek kind of thing? And so like Hope Church that's in the room, they've been walking through a lot of this kind of decision with trying to figure out how does that fit, with their college ministry. When are they going to add that service? Is it going to be better to have it in a midweek kind of time, or is it going to be able to be like a Sunday evening kind of thing? Perkinsville that's in the room, they just added a third service that's at like 6 o'clock on Sundays, and that they use that intentionally. So they jumped to 250 college students by doing it at that time, and that now comprises half of their church. So by doing it that way, it's totally pragmatic, is what it comes back to, is thinking through, hey, with what you're trying to do, what's going to give you the best possible opportunity for success.
All right, so this next question is, where would you recommend a smaller church start to implement a multiplication strategy?
Jonathan, you need to talk about
that. I would start with, and you can really talk to the multiplication, but I would start with just making sure you're thinking about this the right way. I did a breakout at a state convention thing a while ago on sort of this topic, and I was just like, hey, we got to be really careful to make sure the starting place is, hey, the most important thing for multiplication is growth. That's the most important thing. So let's make sure we're not thinking about multiplication before we think about how many first-time guests, baptisms. You go to Acts 2, right? The disciples come from where? They come from the crowds. So there has to be a focus on the crowds. That is the book of Acts. That is Acts 2. And so I would just say, like, hey, what's harder, to multiply or to reach a bunch of people in the crowds? And it's like we got to start with the crowds before we get down to the multiplication, because you can't send out people, you can't multiply what you don't have, right? I mean, if you have 50 people, you send out 25, now you got 25. You send out another 25, how many you got? You got no people. So we got to be growing first.
I would say, just to like cut straight to it, like probably with serve teams. getting more people involved. So if you're a smaller church, maybe you're not ready to jump to the 2 services yet, but there are ways that you can create more opportunity for people to step into serving opportunities. I think that's probably the cleanest way to make the first step. I think the biggest issue around this, especially with smaller churches, that sometimes are still trying to figure out who they're going to be, what their identity is, what that target audience is, who they're going after, all of that. You can have several people in the church that can end up with a lot of control by casting a different vision than what the leadership of the church is casting. And when you do that, you can end up multiplying the wrong things that actually take you off mission. And so you got to be careful. Like if your mission is to grow the church to reach more people, and you end up multiplying something that's like serving some area in the community, well, you've just made that the thing that's become the most important, because that's what's multiplying instead of growing the church. So it can be real tricky in those early stages with saying, okay, what is the thing to focus on? It needs to be the thing that helps you get down the road in regard to what your vision is.
I think too, when you get, Bobby, this is what you were saying, I think is really important, because I think that there's an assumption that the new things that are planted will grow, but I've learned you have to actually say that out loud, that's what you're trying to do, because that assumption has gotten now forgotten. And it's funny. It's like the goal. If you listen close, what you'll realize is like the goal seems like many times it's always to plant more churches, which sounds great, except for that as long as we're assuming that the hope is that those churches grow in number, because if you take one church of 100 and plant 50 out, neither one of them grow, you did not multiply. All you did was divide. That's no different than what you had. You had the same amount in one thing that you had in two, and so I think that it's just important for us to understand that. Like there's an assumption now that the reason we're planting is because we feel like church plants are scrappy and evangelistic, and more people come to Christ in churches that are younger many times. And that, we got to get back into that language of why we multiply. I think the other thing I would say is, I believe sending capacity is more important than seating capacity. But for sending capacity, nothing is more important than seating capacity. If it's saying, hey, it's all about sending, or sending is more important than seating, is like saying the resurrection is more important than Christmas. It's like, yeah, well, I get that, and I sort of agree with that. The resurrection is the most significant thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. No Christmas, no resurrection, If you don't have business success, you can't get to generosity. So you can't start, just really focusing on the one and sort of demonizing the other, or else you're going to undercut it and the whole system stops.
To add to what Jonathan said, okay, if you're a smaller church and you're thinking about multiplication, here's the principle for all of us for multiplication. It's getting people in your church to do something that is inconvenient for them. That is the principle of multiplication. So if there's 2 Sunday school classes in your church, or 2 community groups, and the church is growing and you now need 3, if you have a community group you love, do you want to leave your community group to go to a new community group? No. Multiplication is, I get to the point in terms of character and belief in the mission where I'm now willing to say, I don't want to leave my group, but for the sake of the mission, I'm now going to go to this new group. That's all multiplication is. And if we can't get people to take really small steps like that, you certainly are not going to get people to take the bigger steps of actually moving somewhere, or going to be a missionary, or going on a mission trip. You're just trying to get people to do stuff that's inconvenient for them, but it's all about the mission of God. And so we could do that on any level, right? A church of 20 people can do that.
Yeah, there's something that you can multiply. And calling people into those small steps is so important. Jonathan, you mentioned serve teams. So that's a good segue for this next question, because we talked about the principle that engagement drives attendance. Okay, and so what is our target ratio of volunteers serving to people attending an event? So this goes into some math, right?
Jonathan's not the numbers. He's not the numbers guy.
Totally out of this.
Do you know, though?
I have no idea what the ratio is. Here's what I know. It should be higher.
Okay. We shoot for 20% of total attendance. And, just we haven't talked a ton about how important numbers and metrics are, but we really believe, man, you can't manage it if you do not measure it. So this is something that we look at the highest level, our executive team meeting, every single week. And if we're not at the 20%, it's highlighted in red for everybody to see. And there's probably 12 or 15 metrics like that. But so, for example, if there was 1,000 people on a Sunday total attendance, we would expect that 100 people or 200 people, 20% are serving. And so we've been under that at times, and we've really tried to emphasize, hey, we got to raise up more leaders, we got to raise up more team leaders. And then, Pastor Andrew, you can speak to this. When it comes to the bigger events, like Christmas or something like that, that number is going to need to go up like dramatically. And we use that as an opportunity to try to call people into serving maybe that don't normally serve.
Yeah, I just mentioned that. I think I mentioned it yesterday at some point. I can't remember what talk it was, but the 20% thing is right. But the thing is, on those big days, it's going to be such a higher number of attendance that we got to really juice those the numbers for serving. So, for us, like when we go into a big day like Christmas or Easter or something like that, the ask is always twofold. It's always serve one and bring to one. Serve one and bring to one. Don't come alone, and also don't come just to receive. Do not teach your kids to receive without giving. Like, you don't come in and just sit and receive. That's a volunteer organization. So if you get 20%, you're doing pretty well. But the messaging is, man, don't just come and be one who receives without giving. Like, you need to give your time and your talent away. Another thing you brought up that I think is important is because this is a prime example, I think, of where you go to something like this, you go home, you start to talk about some things in different ways, and you get pushback. And here's where you get the pushback. You start getting serious about numbers and data, and people just get all squirmy about it. It's just like, man, this feels business-like. It doesn't feel spiritual or whatever. And man, it's just one of those things that sounds slick. It sounds spiritual. It's not about the numbers. It's not about the data. It's about people. That just sounds so good. And then you put it under the microscope for like 1 second, and it's just bull. It's just not helpful. It's like, does anybody have that type of attitude about the amount of money that comes into their church? I mean, is there a church in here that I said, how much money came into your church last year? And you get on your little Mortarstone or whatever, and you're like, it was about this, it was kind of close to this number some way. Or is it like, no. When it comes to money, I know every single penny that has come in because of the audit, because of what we're going to do with, with our generosity statements. Like, I know every single penny. I bet you that's kind of where we are. And I think to that, I would just say, like, how dare we count money? How dare we count money better than we count people? Why would that be more important? That our money would be something that we keep a really close eye on. I had an interesting conversation with a guy in Greensboro who I love, brother, in Greensboro, they're leading a good church. And, he was talking to us about our group ministry, and I could just tell, man, he was wearing as a badge that they don't do systems around group because they do people, right? They do spiritual, they do people, they do relationship, they don't do systems. And I'm talking to him, and I'm that's fine. I don't really care, but I don't know about the third thing that got said. It just got under my skin a little bit, okay? And so I said, hey man, I know you guys are super into people shepherding. How many people exactly were in y'all's community groups this week? And he was like, I think he gave me a very rounded number. Oh yeah, we got 200 people in groups. I said, no. How many people were in your groups this week? As in the last 7 days? Well, I'm not really sure. Oh, you don't know? No, I don't know. Why? Well, I mean, we just have about this many. Oh, you don't have a system for that? No. Man, how in the world could you know who they are if you don't even know how many there are? And if you don't know who they are, how in the world could you know how they are? So the idea of we do spiritual, but that doesn't mean numbers, is just like, man, it just, you put it under the microscope and it crumbles. Like in our system, if you don't come to group two or 3 weeks in a row, guess what happens? You get flagged for that. Somebody's going to call you. Somebody's going to ask a group leader like, hey, what's going on with them? Oh, they had football practice. They're jumping back in. No problem. Or, hey, you know what? One of their kids is really sick. They need a pastor to call them. Oh, good. You get to that conversation by having the numbers. I mean, what we say is like, man, the numbers are not the finish line. They're the starting line. But it's hard for us to do ministry without knowing the data, in my opinion.
So there's various church sizes represented in the room, and a lot of them are reaching a barrier, kind of the lid of like, man, we're right at 200 people. We're trying to break through that threshold. What might be some good data points that they need to keep tracking that's going to help them overcome those barriers?
I mean, I would say first-time guests is huge to be able to keep a lock on that. I don't know if you've talked about that this year, but I can't remember if it was in one of your talks or not, but when we came up on the 10 years, one of the things that Andrew had kind of discovered in looking through the numbers is that we had sent 150 people. It was the whole 10-to-1 thing, and we had baptized 1,500, and there had been 15,000 first-time guests. And so just like understanding that first-time guest thing is the lever, it's the lead measure for what leads to the growth. And so when we started tracking that, Bobby set some goals around some first-time guests last year, and that we chased, and man, that was just that helped everybody kind of dial in on making sure that was the thing that everybody was going after.
Yeah, and I think the starting place for kind of different growth barriers would just be, man, how many seats do you have in the auditorium, and what's the percentage of those being filled? How many available spots for kids ministry, and what's the percentage of those being filled? How many parking spaces, what's the percentage of those being filled? And then your speed of decision making. When the church is growing and you do need to launch more stuff, or you need to multiply, does that take 6 months to make a decision, or can you make a decision, in 2 or 3 weeks around that? I would say that's the starting point for figuring out, okay, things have gone well, but it feels like we're hitting a barrier. 200 is a common barrier, 500 is a common barrier, 1,000 is a common barrier, and there's just on and on. But you gotta know what some of those numbers are, or you don't actually know like where the actual barrier is. So like those three things: the seats in the auditorium, the kids space, and the parking. One of the things we do at Mercy Hill, we measure that across every service, every campus. So one of those things our executive team looks at every week is, hey, we basically say, where has the tire run over the hose, and we'll see, hey, if there's a service that's happening multiple weeks, then we have to figure something out, or you'll just naturally hit that barrier. So at one of our campuses, for example, our Northeast campus, over the last year, we launched a third service, and it was just like we had to do that. Otherwise, we were never going to get past that barrier that we kept hitting.
And that threshold is typically 80% capacity?
Yeah, 60 to 80%. There's kind of a field capacity too. Like this room, these chairs are smaller, these aisles are smaller, so it's hard to literally sit, people in every single seat in here.
I think the most common mistake that I see churches do is they just think that their capacity is whatever their auditorium size is. And it's just not. Like, your capacity is equally shared between parking, kids ministry, and auditorium size. So if you have an auditorium that can seat 500, but you don't have the ratios to park the amount of cars, whatever it is, 2.1 humans per car, or whatever we use, it just doesn't matter that you could have an auditorium of 5,000 seats. Doesn't matter. That tire is going to run right over that hose. And the speed of decision making is very important because when the tire starts to run over the hose, you begin to bump the ceiling. You have a kids ministry that is bumping 70% capacity, even though maybe your adult ministry is not. Maybe your parking's fine, but your kids ministry 70, 80, 85%, week in, week out. One of the principles we say here at Mercy Hill is like, when you hit the ceiling hits back. So when you if you just keep bumping that ceiling and just keep letting it go, you're going to solve your own problem eventually by people leaving or not coming anymore. Like, if you're 85% of one of those things over and over and over and over, trust me, you're going to solve the problem. It's just going to be because you end up being back under that number because you didn't. And so the speed of decision making is, how can we maneuver right now? And if that's got to go through 7 committees, if it's got to be signed off on by 6 different people, that's what we mean. And I know some of us are just in situations like that can't be helped, but anything we can do to try to speed up the ability to be nimble, to be flexible with this stuff helps a ton.
All right, I think we got time for one more question. And let's think about other ministries in the church: student ministry, kids ministry, worship ministry. How do we encourage those ministries to think growth-oriented and to implement a growth strategy?
Yeah, well, at Mercy Hill, we treat all those ministries the exact same way. So all the ministries need to have a vision, need to have goals. They need to know how many people were there. They need to have plans to try to get better, to try to reach more people. We celebrate that. It's important. We walk alongside ministries to try to help them. Hey, if there's things that are holding us back, like what can we do? Is it space? Is it budget? Where are we at with those things? And I'll just say this, over time, that's going to make sure that the right people are in the right seats, because there may be ministry leaders over a certain ministry that just have an issue with that. And like Pastor Andrew's saying, it's not about the numbers, and I don't like the count, and that feels unspiritual. And it's like, at least for us, it's like, hey, that's not the way that we view it. It's important for us. Like, man, if you don't know how many there are, you certainly don't know how they are, and it's just important. And so it's just part of our culture. And our teams really work together to help one another, so our communication team, our events team, our different ministries are in some of the same meetings, speaking into, what events are happening. We love doing that, getting multiple ministries together to kind of give ideas to one another. What would y'all add to
and
that?
we don't get to, and I've said this yesterday, we don't get to control what God does with this stuff, but we do get to control what we're trying to do. And so I think that's continually to speak a vision of, what we're trying to do is see more people come in, more people get saved, more people grown up in the faith, more people sent out. We're going to put strategies around that. And there are times where that goes crazy, and God is just blessing it like crazy. And there might be other times where you get stuck, but we get a chance to control what we're trying to do. And it's important that all of our ministries are aligned on what they're trying to do, what they're praying that God would do in their ministry.
A lot of the ministries in our church where they may feel under-resourced at some point in time. And when things are growing, that's when more resources are given to that particular ministry. And so one of the ways that is encouraged is by, hey, when your ministry is growing, then there's going to be more access to more resources. And when your ministry is not growing, well, that's not going to be as available. And so when you have a whole culture that's bent around the growth is the norm, then that's kind of the world that you live in. So everybody knows the expectation is whatever it is that you're leading, everything in that is up and to the right.
Let me give one more example to kind of connect the dots on this, okay? So we know here at Mercy Hill, just based on our own data, we've almost seen 2,000 baptisms in 12 years. We know that half of those have been college students. So probably 1,000 college students have been baptized. And we know that half of the people that are sent out of Mercy Hill as missionaries or that go on church plants were college students that we met on the college campus. So that's the output. That's extremely important to reach college students because they're a huge part of sending here at Mercy Hill. So I would say this, in terms of like our college attendance at the actual gathering, we are obsessed with that. Like, we know those numbers every single week. We're praying, man, how can we help with budget, with leadership, anything we could do. So like our college gathering, we're sitting here on Wednesday morning. Our college gathering happened on Tuesday night. All three of us know how many people were there last night. Like, we already know that number because we're celebrating it. It's something we've been praying for. And I think that just shows you the connection between, a ministry growing and focusing on that, and then the ultimate output of multiplication, mission, what we're trying to do.
It's been a really good conversation. Great questions that you submitted. Thank you for submitting those. Any final thoughts as we wrap up here? All right. Well, hey, maybe your question did not get answered, but that helped us to think of subjects that we need to address in future podcast episodes. So check out the podcast, and we'll look forward to answering those questions then.